Bodybuilding has carried a heavy label for decades, being one of the most dangerous sports in the world. For a lot of people on the outside, all it takes is hearing about extreme muscle, drugs, and early deaths to jump to a simple conclusion: this sport kills. And when we see young athletes dying before they even turn 30, that judgment starts to feel pretty reasonable. These tragedies have become so common that they've almost lost their shock value. Another name, another funeral, another goodbye post on social media. And that leads to an uncomfortable question. Is bodybuilding really the problem, or are we aiming at the wrong target? Here's the truth, and this needs to be clear from the start. Bodybuilding itself is not the killer. Training hard, building muscle, and stepping on stage are not automatic death sentences. The real danger begins when factors that most people prefer to ignore come into play. What destroys these bodies is an explosive combination of epigenetic factors: weak genetics, steroid abuse, heavy alcohol use, recreational drugs, stimulants, extreme protocols, and a completely out-of-control lifestyle. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire that was already starting. When you stack all of that on top of a body carrying dozens of extra pounds of mass, constantly stressing the heart, kidneys, and blood vessels day after day, the outcome is almost never pretty. This video isn't about demonizing the sport. It's about exposing the raw reality behind it. There's one factor in bodybuilding that almost no one likes to face head-on. Weight is weight. It doesn't matter if those extra 50 to 200 pounds, roughly 23 to 90 kilograms, come from fat or muscle. To the body, especially the internal organs, the demand is exactly the same. The heart has to pump blood through a much larger volume of tissue. The kidneys filter more, the blood vessels operate under constant pressure, and the cardiovascular system lives on the edge 24 hours a day. The danger isn't during the workout, it's during rest, during sleep, when the body is supposed to recover. A lot of people believe they can offset this with more cardio, regular checkups, smart supplementation, or supposedly clean protocols. But the reality is harsh. There is no physiological shortcut. No supplement, no magic strategy can erase the overload caused by extreme mass. The heart tries to adapt, growing bigger and stronger to keep up. The problem is that this adaptation isn't always healthy. Over time, the walls thicken, elasticity is lost, and efficiency drops. That's the beginning of a silent process that's often irreversible. And then comes the question very few people are brave enough to ask: how much extra weight is really worth the risk? Because once the body crosses a certain line, it doesn't ask for permission. It collects. And almost always, it collects at a very high price. So now, we're going to look at some real cases of athletes who shocked the world through what their autopsies revealed. Aziz Shavershian, ZYZZ, wasn't just a name. He became a symbol, an icon of aesthetics, motivation, and the whole idea of living life to the fullest. Millions of young people around the world started training because of him. At just 22 years old, ZYZZ looked like he had it all, except the one thing that mattered most: time. The autopsy was blunt and unforgiving. ZYZZ had a severely enlarged heart. This wasn't mild. It wasn't a small detail. It was a serious, silent, and extremely dangerous condition, especially in someone that young. The kind of issue that turns intense physical effort into a game of Russian roulette. And the warning signs were there. Months before his death, Aziz was already dealing with high blood pressure, shortness of breath, and clear signs of cardiovascular stress. Symptoms that, in any other context, would have set off major alarm bells. But inside the no pain, no gain mindset, they were ignored, normalized, brushed off as weakness. His lifestyle only made things worse. Constant partying, recreational drug use, aggressive cycles, and extreme training created the perfect storm. A structurally compromised heart being pushed past its limits day after day, with no real recovery. ZYZZ died on August 5, 2011, inside a sauna, far from the stage, far from the cameras, when his body simply couldn't take it anymore. His case became the ultimate reminder that youth doesn't protect anyone. A young heart can fail, and when it does, there's no second chance. Boston Lloyd built his reputation by going straight against everything bodybuilding tried to keep hidden. While the industry sold illusions, he showed the raw, unfiltered reality. He spoke openly about steroids, site enhancement oils, extreme protocols, and all the things that usually stayed behind the scenes. To many, he was a hero. To others, he was a problem. He didn't just talk, he showed it. Boston filmed injections, explained dosages, exposed risks, and tore apart the theater of so-called natural transformations. That level of honesty made sponsors, federations, and much of the sport's elite uncomfortable. But the highest price didn't come from the industry. It came from his own body. At just 29 years old, Boston suffered an aortic dissection. In simple terms, the largest artery in the body tore from the inside. When that happens, survival odds are extremely low. It's sudden, catastrophic, and almost always fatal. There's no time to react. What many people forget is that his body had been breaking down long before that moment. Boston was already dealing with stage 5 kidney failure, the final stage before complete renal shutdown. Years of chemical abuse had taken a toll that no human body can sustain forever. And there was also the genetic factor. His father had suffered an aneurysm, a clear sign of inherited cardiovascular vulnerability. Boston inherited a fragile system and chose to push it under extreme stress. He died young, on February 25, 2022, at 29 years old, but he died telling the truth. Scott Klene represents a side of bodybuilding that almost never makes the magazine covers. On the outside, he was massive, impressive, impossible to ignore. On the inside, his body was a minefield. Scott became known for his extreme use of site enhancement oil. That oil didn't just deform muscles. It triggered chronic inflammation, silent infections, and constant stress on vital organs. But the oil was only part of the problem. Scott stacked it with heavy anabolic steroids, aggressive stimulants, and recreational drugs, creating a cocktail that kept his body in a permanent state of alarm. Outside the gym, things were even worse. People close to him described a completely out-of-control lifestyle, driven by non-stop partying, chemical abuse, and extreme decisions. To sustain all of this, Scott reportedly became involved in an underground economy, a dark side of the fitness industry that's rarely talked about, but has existed and still exists far from the spotlight. That parallel reality exposes an uncomfortable truth. Not every athlete lives off glamour, sponsorships, and brand deals. Many get trapped in dangerous cycles, trying to support a body their own physiology can no longer handle. Scott Klene died at 30 years old, officially from kidney failure. But reducing his death to a single organ shutting down oversimplifies what really happened. It was the accumulation of excess, extreme choices, and irreversible damage that pushed his body to collapse. His case shows that in bodybuilding, what destroys lives isn't just what happens on stage, it's everything that happens away from it. Luke Sandoe was a respected name in the British bodybuilding scene. Experienced, disciplined, and known for taking preparation extremely seriously. But it was that obsessive pursuit of the perfect physique that ultimately cost him his life. Luke died at 32 years old on May 7, 2020, shortly after going through one of the most brutal phases in the sport, final competition prep. During his cutting phase, he entered an aggressive diuretic protocol designed to strip water from the body and create that dry, stage-ready look. The problem is, those drugs don't care about aesthetics versus survival. The dehydration became so severe that his kidneys shut down, pushing his body to the edge of total systemic failure. What makes this case even more disturbing is what came out afterward. Emails exchanged between Luke and his coach revealed risky protocols, dangerous instructions, and clear medical negligence. This wasn't a one-off mistake. It was a system pushing an athlete past the limit, even when the warning signs were impossible to ignore. The medical report was devastating. Luke had a severely enlarged heart with acute ventricular failure. His heart muscle was thickened, stiff, and unable to function properly. This wasn't a random event. His heart had been deteriorating for a long time. The coroner didn't sugarcoat it. Bodybuilding was identified as the primary cause of the cardiac damage, not as a recreational activity, but as an extreme practice fueled by drugs, aesthetic pressure, and inhumane protocols. Luke Sandoe's case exposed something many people would rather deny. Sometimes the danger isn't hidden at all. It's documented, written in emails, and ignored until it's too late. Dan Pucket was exactly the kind of athlete who seemed to be doing everything right. Young, disciplined, an NPC national champion, with a future in the sport that looked almost guaranteed. At just 22 years old, he already had major titles under his belt and was seen as a solid rising star in competitive bodybuilding. The day before his death, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Dan came back from training complaining only about muscle soreness, something completely normal for any athlete who lives at the edge of intensity. There was no fainting, no dramatic collapse, no clear sign that something serious was unfolding. Hours later, he was found dead in the bathroom of his home. The news shocked not just his family and friends, but the entire bodybuilding community. The autopsy revealed the real cause: sudden cardiac failure. His heart simply stopped. This type of death is especially terrifying because it comes with no warning. There's no time to react, no second chance. No, I'll see a doctor tomorrow. The heart fails in an instant, and everything ends right there. Andreas Munzer was held up as the definition of perfection in bodybuilding. A direct product of the extreme aesthetic school, he chased something almost impossible: absolute conditioning, near-zero body fat, skin glued to muscle. On stage, he looked superhuman. Off stage, his body was falling apart. Behind that clean appearance was a chemical protocol that was completely insane. Andreas used extreme amounts of diuretics, anabolic steroids, stimulants, and drying agents, all at the same time. The goal was to eliminate every last drop of water from his body, even if that meant destroying vital organs in the process. When he was admitted to the hospital, what doctors found was shocking: internal bleeding, multiple organ failure, and a circulatory system in total collapse. His blood literally could no longer clot. His body was so dehydrated and so intoxicated that it could no longer sustain life. Andreas Munzer died at 31 years old during an emergency surgery. The official cause was multiple organ failure, but the real reason was obvious. His body had been pushed far beyond any possible physiological limit. This wasn't an accident. It was the direct result of years of extreme abuse in pursuit of a look that the human body simply cannot sustain. Daniel Alexander was exactly the kind of athlete who looked ready to break out on the professional stage. A Mr. USA middleweight champion, an IFBB pro, with a well-balanced physique and huge expectations surrounding his name. At 29 years old, he was deep into prep for another competition, living in that phase where everything gets pushed to the extreme. His death came wrapped in silence. Very few official details, no clear explanation, just a context every competitive bodybuilder understands all too well. Severe calorie restriction, aggressive dehydration, drying drugs, and an insane level of physical stress. The classic combination that pushes the body to its limit, and sometimes past it. Robert Benavente followed a very similar path. After winning the Southern States, it looked like he was finally cashing in on years of sacrifice. 1 year later, at just 30 years old, he suffered a fatal heart attack. The stage had rewarded the work, but his body had already been showing deep signs of wear. What connects these two cases isn't just age or competitive status. It's the dangerous illusion that being shredded, dry, and decorated with trophies automatically means being healthy. In bodybuilding, the external look often hides organs under extreme strain and systems on the edge of collapse. Daniel Alexander and Robert Benavente didn't die for no reason. They died believing the body could always handle one more adjustment, one more cycle, one more prep. Dallas McCarver is another name that can't be left out of this conversation. He was an incredibly promising IFBB pro, one of the brightest young stars of his generation, and he died at just 26 years old. On the surface, Dallas looked like the future of bodybuilding. Massive, conditioned, disciplined, everything the sport celebrates. But internally, his body was aging at a terrifying pace. The autopsy findings were shocking. Several of his internal organs were up to 3 times larger than normal, a level of enlargement that's rare even in elderly patients with severe chronic disease. This wasn't mild stress or early warning damage. It was advanced, systemic breakdown happening in a man who hadn't even reached his late 20s. Dallas suffered from severe left ventricular hypertrophy, meaning the main pumping chamber of his heart had become dangerously thick and rigid. On top of that, he had advanced atherosclerosis, hardened, narrowed arteries that you would expect to see in much older individuals, not in someone in peak physical condition by outward appearance. Steroid use and other performance-enhancing drugs were cited directly in the medical report as determining factors. This wasn't speculation. It was documented. And as if that wasn't enough, Dallas also had a family history of cardiovascular disease, which made the entire situation even more dangerous. A genetically vulnerable system was pushed under extreme chemical and physical stress. Dallas McCarver's case is one of the clearest examples of what happens when the body ages decades ahead of schedule. At 26, his physique looked elite, but his organs told a completely different story. When you line up these autopsy reports side by side, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. The patterns repeat. Different names, different stories, but the reports tell almost the exact same tale. That's not a coincidence. It's a biological script that plays out when the human body is pushed beyond its natural limits. The most common finding is an enlarged heart, what doctors call cardiomegaly. A heart that grows too large isn't a strong heart. It's a heart under distress. It loses efficiency, loses elasticity, and starts working in a more dangerous and unstable way until it finally gives out. Along with that, you almost always see left ventricular hypertrophy. The heart wall becomes thick, stiff, and unable to pump blood properly. Add early-onset atherosclerosis to the mix, hardened, narrowed arteries in people who, by age alone, should have clean and healthy vessels. The biological clock speeds up fast, very fast. Another constant pattern is kidney failure. Kidneys overloaded by extreme dehydration, drugs, high blood pressure, and abusive protocols eventually collapse. And when the heart and kidneys start failing together, the outcome is usually rapid and irreversible. Behind all of it, the same backdrop keeps showing up over and over again. Anabolic steroids, diuretics, stimulants, and site enhancement oils. After everything you've seen here, it's impossible to treat these deaths as just numbers. These aren't cold statistics. They were real people with dreams, plans, families, and futures that were cut short far too early. Every case shown in this video carries the same silent warning. The body has limits, and ignoring them comes at a very high cost. If you train, compete, or simply admire the sport, this video is an invitation to awareness. Know the risks, get regular medical checkups, and above all, learn to respect the signals your body sends. No physique, no title, no trophy is worth your life. And if this content made you think, hit the like button. It helps the channel more than you might realize. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and if you want to support deeper, unfiltered content like this, become a channel member and be part of a community that values real information, not fantasy.